I am ex-Detective Inspector Walter Henry Thompson and was Winston Churchill's bodyguard for a period of nearly 18 years.
In almost any piece of film you'll see of Britain's great wartime leader, this is the man in the background, anonymous and secret. Until now, his critical role in saving the life of Churchill from a series of attacks has been hidden from the wider public.
He himself intended that he would never be taken alive, and he issued direct instructions to me. I was to have his 4.5 Colt fully loaded. He intended to use every bullet but one on the enemy. The last one he saved for himself.
After the war, Walter Thompson's censored book told just part of the story. His full memoirs were suppressed even by Churchill himself. Only now can we recount the number of assassination attempts on Churchill's life, many foiled by Walter. This series, with unique access to these incredible memoirs, reveals for the first time the story of Walter's life with Winston. Together they traveled thousands of miles on precarious journeys to meet Stalin and Roosevelt and other world leaders. Together they rode with Lawrence of Arabia, dodged German assassins, were nearly shot down by enemy aircraft, lone gunmen, U-boats, and IRA hitmen. This is a story of the political upheavals of the 20th century. Churchill's constant brushes with death and the role played by an ex-post office messenger in preventing an early end to his life.
And with this weapon, he was a dead shot. Anyone that came within range of this weapon would never survive.
On the 3rd of September 1939, the day war was declared on Nazi Germany, Winston Churchill was put in charge of the Royal Navy. It was the same post he had held at the beginning of the First World War. And a delighted Admiralty signaled to all ships, Winston's back. So too was his bodyguard, the former Scotland Yard inspector Walter Thompson. Just before the war, when warned by French intelligence of a Nazi plot to assassinate him, Winston had recalled Walter to his service after an absence of more than 7 years. Walter had not hesitated to rejoin his old friend, but could hardly have anticipated the burden which he was taking on. For the next 5.5 years, there would be the constant stress of keeping his boss safe, not just from assassins, but from all the risks of war. Almost immediately, Walter had to grapple with Winston's determination to get as close to the action as possible, and his almost total disregard for his own safety. Now permanently attached to Winston Churchill again as his personal bodyguard, Walter Thompson accompanied him to Downing Street, and with Clementine Churchill was the first to hear the news.
His appointment was well received all over the country, and right away I had a taste of the late hours which were to be my lot for nearly 6 years. From this day through to the very end, it does not seem I ever for one night had enough sleep.
It was a grinding schedule, which eventually took its toll. But it was to be more than late hours which were to be Walter's lot. For the man he was guarding was the most feared of Hitler's foes, and already marked down as an assassination target.
Winston made a special request to the newspapers that no reference should be made to my appointment, and no photographs of himself and me together should be published for some months. However, within 6 months, a well-known London newspaper brought me into public notice with a paragraph entitled, "Winston finds his shadow again," with a silhouette of me at the top of the paragraph. The Germans soon took notice, and in one of their broadcasts to this country stated that all the Thompsons in England would not prevent them from assassinating Churchill when they were ready.
For the next 6 years, this was to be Walter's constant nightmare. He tried to take precautions.
We found time, especially at first with the war going, to reacquaint Winston with firearms. He carried his own pistol now, and we had a target range in the basements of various buildings, as well as one in his own home.
These were his favorite weapons. The Mannlicher rifle, the .38 Webley Scott, 4.5 Colt automatic. This was really his favorite weapon, and with this weapon he was a dead shot.
But Walter's main problem was how to make Winston take his own safety seriously.
Now that the man had grown older, his sense of personal safety had largely left him, to the extent that he would tire of carrying his revolver and forget it. It was, of course, absolutely essential that he should not be alone at any time, even in the middle of the night in his own bed, without a revolver in his reach. He knew about this, but his excitement about the danger had changed from the chemical to the intellectual. I had to watch him all the time. He would draw his gun and pop it into sudden view, and say roguishly and with delight, "You see, Thompson, they'll never take me alive. I'll get one or two before they can shoot me down."
Winston's determination to expose himself to danger would be one of Walter's constant problems over the next 6 years. But his first experience of guarding him once war had begun was less serious.
My first walk in the blackout with Winston was unfortunate, as I walked into a tree. It was only just in time to prevent him doing the same thing.
Winston's return to the Admiralty did not start well.
Within 24 hours of taking over, German U-boat warfare had its first big trophy. The Athenia was torpedoed and sunk, with 1,400 aboard, including some Americans.
This was to be followed by a steady stream of sinkings. Winston had ordered the mining and blockading of German ports and the reintroduction of convoying as soon as the war began, but peacetime economies had left the Royal Navy perilously short of escorts. Many merchant ships had to travel independently, and the U-boats were able to prey on these with little interruption. The only real solution to the problem would be the building of more escorts, so Winston focused mainly on trying to make good the years of underfunding and neglect suffered by the Royal Navy. He immediately started a tour of all the major fleet installations. And as he and Walter visited the main fleet anchorage at Scapa Flow aboard a destroyer, they had a prophetic conversation.
After passing through an entrance at Scapa, where there were nets, booms and Aztecs, I asked Winston if it were not possible for a German submarine to have followed us into Scapa before the boom closed. He replied, "I hope they will not be able to do so. According to the powers that be who have given me the information on this subject, the possibility of U-boats entering is very remote."
Unfortunately, the powers that be were wrong. A month later, U-47, commanded by Captain Gunther Prien, slipped into the anchorage in just the way that Walter had feared, and sank the battleship Royal Oak. He became a national hero and was decorated with the Knight's Cross to the Iron Cross by Hitler himself.
This was a bitter blow to Winston, and I heard him mutter, "If only they'd taken notice of me a few years ago, this would not have happened."
After this disaster, the fleet was withdrawn from Scapa Flow to Greenock, while defences were strengthened. When it returned, Winston insisted on accompanying it aboard the flagship, HMS Nelson. During the visit, Walter was struck by Winston's eagle eye for detail.
Later, whilst walking on the quarterdeck of the Hood, Winston suddenly went to the side of the ship and looked intently across the flow. He then remarked, "Look, Thompson, there are no seagulls round those dummy ships. I must arrange for food to be thrown out around them. Otherwise, a German reconnaissance plane will see that they are dummies. He never missed a thing.
During the early months of the war, merchant ship sinkings did not reach crisis level. And once a solution had been found to the new magnetic mine, which the Germans began using, the naval war seemed under control. Both Winston and Walter may have been lulled into a false sense of security. For both men, there would soon be a rude awakening. With the naval war apparently under control, Winston, being Winston, could not resist offering advice in many areas outside his strict departmental responsibilities.
During the early months of the war, from time to time, Winston submitted to the Prime Minister reports and suggestions for carrying on the war. They were ignored, and Winston felt the snubs deeply. There was no doubt that he recognised the sincere honesty of Neville Chamberlain, but at the same time, he also realised that Chamberlain had no idea of war.
The other main area of naval action was tracking down the surface raiders which Germany had sent to sea before the outbreak of war. Winston became heavily involved when the pocket battleship Graf Spee, which had been causing havoc to British shipping in the Indian Ocean and South Atlantic, was cornered off Uruguay by 3 British cruisers. Although totally outgunned, the British ships closed in.
Whilst the news of the battle was coming through, Winston frequently visited the Admiralty map room to know the latest movements of the ships concerned. Although normally he was quick to show emotion, during this period he remained absolutely poker-faced until the end of the battle. When the news was received that the Graf Spee had been scuttled, his pleasure was evident.
Winston was quick to arrange a celebration of the victory when the cruisers got home. For Walter, this became the first of many times when his boss's life was as much at risk from well-wishers as from assassins.
Later, at the Guildhall luncheon, to which the crews were invited, I had many anxious moments. After the luncheon, the crews came out and immediately surrounded Winston. I was never more needed as a bodyguard than them, to save him from his friends. It happened that we had to wait for our car, and every sailor wanted to shake his hand. They appeared in their hundreds. Those who were unable to shake his hand commenced to pat him on the back. I saw him flinch, and I knew I had to do something. These boys were tough, and they put real beef into their pats. I stepped forward and literally covered Winston's back with my body. How thankful I was when the car arrived, for he was visibly shaken.
A little while after this, it was learned that British prisoners from the ship sunk during her raiding by the Graf Spee had been put on board the German supply ship Altmark, and that she was trying to slip back to Germany through the British blockade. Winston ordered that she must be stopped at all costs.
Every effort was now being made to locate the ship, and she was eventually seen in Norwegian waters, hugging the coast on her way to Germany. Winston issued instructions to Captain Vian, in charge of HMS Cossack, who had located the Altmark, to go in and board her. There was a point of international law in connection with this order, but after the Norwegian authorities had examined the Altmark and stated that there were no prisoners aboard, which was incorrect, the ship was boarded, and soon the words were heard, "The Navy is here," and nearly 300 British prisoners of war were released.
His return to working for Winston, and the 24-hour-a-day demands which this put on him, proved the final straw for Walter's marriage. He and his wife had now drifted almost completely apart. But he was not without female company, for Winston's secretary, Mary Sherburne, had to keep the same sort of hours as he did. In Mary's memoirs, she noted, "At this time, I was thrown into the company of Inspector Thompson. Tommy, as I learned to call him, was never far from Churchill's side, but when the boss was safe in his Admiralty office, or after he became Prime Minister in May 1940 in the Cabinet Room, Tommy often had no place of his own to wait. The nearest point to the man he was guarding, other than sitting in a corridor, was usually my office. He would often have to sit there for hours, and soon we got into the habit of going to lunch together. He explained that he was married, but that for some years he and his wife had not got on well, having originally disagreed over the long and uncertain hours of his job as bodyguard to Winston Churchill and other notable politicians. Tommy is an extremely upright man, and there was never any suggestion from him that our relationship was other than that of two people thrown together by our work being friendly to one another. I remember wondering how many other men would have behaved as correctly as he did when, to get a breath of air, I accompanied him on his late-night security patrol in the deserted grounds of Chartwell. Winston and Walter made several trips to France to meet the French Naval Command, and on one occasion at least they were accompanied by Mary Sherburne. Her presence on board the destroyer HMS Codrington caused a minor sensation, since at that time women were not normally allowed on Royal Navy ships.
I was, of course, no end pleased to find her aboard, and thereafter not at all surprised at the stir she caused. It's a wonder we made land. She was not only given every possible attention, she was given more than she needed, each man outdoing the other in forcing hospitality upon her. She loved it too.
Walter tried to make light of it, but towards the end his tone seems to betray something else. This was certainly what Mary Sherburne believed. Tommy, who was naturally there to guard the boss, was a little chilly to me for much of this trip. At one point in the tour, the officers invited me into the wardroom. We were all drinking and talking happily when I caught sight of Tommy standing in the doorway. He wore a black expression. Ah, I thought. Walter and Winston returned to London from his last visit to France on the 6th of April. 3 days later, the Germans invaded both Denmark and Norway. For Winston, the Allied failure to prevent the German occupation of Norway brought matters to a head. Although the government won a vote of confidence, many Conservative MPs voted against their party. Chamberlain decided that he could not go on, and that a coalition government must be established to fight the war. The Labour Party then announced that it would not join a coalition led by Chamberlain.
On May the 10th, 1940, Winston, the man of destiny, came into his own, and he was sent for by the King to go to Buckingham Palace, where the King asked him to form a government. Now at last, despite all the defeats of early days and 10 years in the political wilderness, the climax had come. When he alighted from the car on his return to the Admiralty after his audience with the King, he turned to me and said, "You know why I've been to Buckingham Palace, Thompson?" "Yes, sir," I answered, and congratulated him. He looked pleased, but he was tense and strained. I went on, "I'm very pleased that you have at last become Prime Minister, sir. But I wish that the position had come your way in better times, for you have undertaken an enormous task." Gravely he replied, "God alone knows how great it is. All I hope is that it's not too late. I'm very much afraid it is, but we can only do our best." Tears came into his eyes, and as he turned away, he muttered something to himself. Then he set his jaw, and with a look of determination mastering all emotion, he entered the Admiralty and began to climb the stairs. Never again at any time after this did he give me the slightest idea that we should not win. It was always, "We shall win, Thompson." The man England needed had arrived in the position for which he was destined. His appointment was acclaimed by allies and neutrals alike, but the Axis forces dreaded it. Had not Hitler already said that he dreaded the day if England and Germany were at war and Churchill came to any position of power? for he would bring the whole world against Germany.
Walter must have been sure that his boss was now Hitler's #1 target, and that an attempt to eliminate him could not be far off. At the moment that Winston became Prime Minister, it did not look as if Hitler was going to have anything to dread, for on the morning of Friday, the 10th of May, as Winston was being invited to the palace, German forces moved decisively into the attack.
The German armies were already streaming across Holland as Winston became Prime Minister. And, as he has said, as I went to bed at about 3 a.m., I was conscious of a profound sense of relief. At last, I had the authority to give directions over the whole scene.
By the time Parliament met on Monday the 13th of May, the Germans had effectively occupied Holland. Allied forces, as planned, swung forward into Belgium to meet them. Churchill was somberly realistic.
In his first speech after becoming Prime Minister, Winston outlined the formation of his government, which was to include men of all parties. He put the people of Britain on their mettle. He understood them and believed in telling them right from the beginning exactly what we were up against, offering nothing but blood, toil, tears and sweat. His thoughts at this time went back to all his years in and out of office. As he said on becoming Prime Minister, I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. I thought I knew a good deal about it all, and I was sure I should not fail.
Winston may have been exhilarated by the challenge he now faced, and the adrenaline of power seemed to sweep him along. But for Walter, the reality of Winston becoming Prime Minister was an enormously increased workload.
Up to this time, the members of his personal staff had been working at full stretch. We were soon to find out that now that Winston was Prime Minister, even more was required of us. He never seemed to stop for a minute. Backward and forward he would go to number 10 Downing Street, across Horse Guards Parade, and would enter by the garden door.
Even though he was now Prime Minister, Winston did not move into 10 Downing Street for more than a month and continued living in the flat in the Admiralty building. Alongside the workload was the knowledge that his boss was now the Germans' main target, and that despite the success of British intelligence in rounding up all known German spies, the possibility of a sleeper being activated to kill the one man Hitler really feared must always have preyed on Walter's mind. On Tuesday, the 14th of May, the day after his first speech as Prime Minister, any hope that Winston might enjoy a brief honeymoon in the job evaporated. For as Walter laconically put it,
the news that Winston was now Prime Minister galvanized the nation. For at that time, the news in the military sense could not have been blacker.
Walter was not exaggerating, for the Dutch lasted only 5 days before surrendering. Even more seriously for the Allied defences, the bulk of the German panzers had pushed through the supposedly impassable forests and hills of the Ardennes region of southern Belgium to outflank the French Maginot Line. They then burst out into the open plain of northern France and southern Belgium, threatening to cut behind the main Allied army, which had swung forward into Belgium. Early on the 15th of May, the French Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, telephoned Winston to say that a French counterattack had failed and that the way to Paris was now effectively open. Winston realized that only his personal intervention could save the day and persuade the French to fight on. He must personally go to France to see the French leadership. The next day, Walter and he began the first of the 3 trips to France they were to complete before the end of May. All the trips were by air, amid increasingly chaotic conditions, and exposed Winston to enormous risk. The Luftwaffe effectively ruled the skies, and the German forces were getting ever closer to Paris. The risk of being shot down was considerable, and there was the additional danger that German agents might get to know of the British Prime Minister's visits and be able to assassinate him.
We had journeyed to Paris accompanied by Lord Halifax and the heads of the services. Whilst the meeting in Paris was in progress, I witnessed the burning of piles of documents and was told that, as they expected the Germans to get to Paris, as many as possible must be destroyed.
They returned on the 17th of May to Hendon, where Winston was described by one of his new private secretaries as looking surprisingly cheerful. He was certainly ready to have some fun at Lord Halifax's expense.
On the return journey, Winston surprised everybody by turning to Lord Halifax and saying, "We will have a cabinet meeting tonight at 10 p.m. The latter was dismayed. "Surely not tonight, Winston," he protested. "We have had a long day. It will make such a late night." "All right," replied Winston. "We'll make it 9:30 instead."
Winston may have been buoyed up by his success in persuading Reynaud that all was not lost and that France must fight on, but as Walter soon gathered, he was not over-optimistic.
Following the cabinet meeting on our return from Paris, I was waiting inside number 10 Downing Street in a position to be able to see Winston come out of the cabinet room and to be able to follow him if he should decide to leave either by the front door or through the garden. With me was a civil servant, who, when Mr. Chamberlain came out of the meeting, asked him if there was anything new. He looked very tired and grave, but with some spirit he said, "He's just come back from Paris and is of the opinion that the Germans will reach there. Of course they will not. The French will stop them."
Chamberlain was being over-optimistic. While Winston and Walter were in Paris, the German panzers were racing towards the Channel coast, threatening to cut the Allied armies in two. By the 20th, they had done so, and were threatening Boulogne and Calais, the two ports on which the British army in northern France depended for supplies. On the 25th, realizing the danger that his army might be cut off and destroyed, the British commander Lord Gort advised the government that he was falling back to the Channel ports and that an emergency evacuation would be necessary. On the 27th of May, the Belgians surrendered, and a motley collection of small boats began to rescue the British and French forces trapped around the port of Dunkirk.
Now came the miracle of Dunkirk. Again we travelled to Paris, while ships of all kinds were already evacuating troops from the beaches of Dunkirk. As we were crossing the Channel, Winston wanted the pilot of our aircraft to go near the Dunkirk beaches. However, he kept rigidly to our course. It should be recorded here that on this journey, Winston refused an air escort so that the fighters could help to cover the Dunkirk evacuation. I've never known such tension as I saw with Winston during these vital days. Every minute he wanted news and more news. In between times, he would call me into his room and tell me what he had heard. As the time went on, I began to notice a change in his bearing and a lessening of the tension. Before going to dinner one evening, he turned to me and said with obvious pleasure, "Thompson, how many men do you think we have evacuated from Dunkirk?" I replied, "I'm afraid I cannot guess, sir, as I do not know the number of troops we had in Belgium." "Have a guess. Have a guess," he insisted. His face was much more cheerful as I suggested, 50,000, sir? "Thompson," he said, "I thought we should be lucky if we got 20,000 safely home. But now, thank God, 90,000 are already back in England, and we hope for many more to come." The following day, he was like a man from whom a great load had been lifted. Almost any vessel that could float was used to get the troops off the beaches, and many of them were manned by volunteers.
It was while these epic events were being played out that Winston first began to use Chequers Court, the British Prime Minister's official country residence near Wendover in Buckinghamshire. the use of Chartwell had been vetoed on security grounds.
Unfortunately, at this time, Chartwell, his own country home, seemed out of the question for weekend visits, as it was in a direct line in peacetime for aircraft from France to London. Their route passed right over the house, and it was thought unwise to use it.
Winston's weekends at Chequers soon became a regular ritual.
The arrival of the Prime Minister's party at Chequers, usually on a Friday evening, was like a miniature invasion. There would be several carloads of distinguished guests, mostly service chiefs, and his normal staff who soon learnt that they would not be able to expect a weekend of leisure. From the moment of his arrival to that of his departure on Monday morning, it was unceasing activity all the time. Often on arrival at the house, Winston would be found to be fast asleep in his car, with his black satin bandage over his eyes. But within minutes of arrival, he would awake. Then he would have a bath and put on his suit, in which he spent most of the weekend, which he called my rompers. It was more widely known as a siren suit, as it had first been used during air raids and put on at the sound of the sirens. He would relax for a brief spell to see films, to which most of the staff were invited, but there was always a skeleton left on duty in the office. It might be thought that when the weekend film shows were over, everybody would go to bed. This was far from so. Winston seemed to be rejuvenated after the films, and he would work on until any time up to 4 a.m. Music was another form of relaxation which appealed to him, and in this sphere his tastes were mostly simple. His favourite songs at the time included Keep Right On to the End of the Road, the Harry Lauder classic, from which he seemed to derive certain inspiration, Run Rabbit Run, Poor Old Joe, and Home Sweet Home, the last named always bringing tears to his eyes. Often he would be alone in the Great Hall and would put on the radiogram, military band records or popular songs, meantime marching up and down the room absolutely absorbed. I sometimes came upon him when this was going on, as I had to pass through the Great Hall. He had on one of his beautiful dressing gowns, and as he marched up and down he hummed the melody, and at each end of the hall he would religiously mark time, right turn, and march back again. Often he did not seem to see me, so deeply absorbed was he. Once, however, he looked up, saw me, stopped, marked time, and with an impish grin continued his marching. At this time, June 1940, we all felt that a crisis was at hand, and there is no doubt that Winston's ability to relax as described above was of inestimable value to him.
For the crisis was, if anything, about to get even worse. It was during his first weekend staying at Chequers that Churchill dictated the great speech he was to give in the House of Commons on the 4th of June, the day the Dunkirk evacuation ended.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old.
It was just one of the many great speeches he dictated to Mary Sherburne during this period, as he tried to find words to rally his countrymen for the great battle. Over 338,000 men, including 120,000 French, had been rescued from Dunkirk, and Churchill must have known in his bones that France was doomed. But for the next 2 weeks, he devoted enormous efforts to keeping her in the war. While the Dunkirk pocket was being eliminated, the Germans had halted to refit and resupply. On the 5th of June, they attacked again and swiftly broke through. As the Germans pushed towards Paris, Winston was desperate to get to see Reynaud again. But the French government was now preparing to leave the capital, and no one would agree to meet him. Finally, on the 11th, he was invited to go to Briare, near Orléans, about 70 miles south of Paris, where the French military headquarters was now based. At the meeting of the Supreme War Council, which followed, Winston advised the French that whatever they did, Britain would fight on. Most of the French who heard him assumed that he was joking. Even while this meeting was going on, Paris was declared an open city, and Winston returned to London the next day, having achieved nothing. Despite this, when Reynaud telephoned him that evening asking him to return for a meeting at Tours the next day, Winston willingly accepted. Walter accompanied him on the journey, which began with the British party having no clear idea of exactly where they were to meet the French.
Actually, on our way over the English Channel, we were in a way flying blind, as we waited for instructions as to where the French cabinet could be found. What strange, what incredible days these were. The Prime Minister of Great Britain, high in the air, trying to discover the whereabouts of our principal ally at this time. It was like a terrible fantasy. Flying across to Tours, I could see the masses of struggling refugees with every kind of transport, even to children's perambulators loaded with the few possessions they were able to take. Going in the opposite direction were a number of troops and French service vehicles, but owing to the masses of refugees, their progress was very slow. It was a heart-rending sight, and I noticed how moved Winston was as he looked down and saw the teeming masses. We arrived to find that Monsieur Reynaud was not available until after luncheon, and we were advised to go to a local restaurant. The place was closed, but the French representatives with us gained us admission. We were told that little food was available, but that the proprietor would do his best. Some food was provided, but none of those present felt like eating as masses of refugees crowded round the windows of the restaurant. We returned to the town hall, where it was learned that all the French service chiefs and many of their cabinet were prepared to surrender, the exceptions being Monsieur Reynaud and Georges Mandel, the Minister of the Interior. It was evident to Winston, Lord Halifax and Lord Beaverbrook, the latter now Minister of Aircraft Production, who made up the English party, that the French were nearly finished. Winston used all his eloquence and persuasion to keep them in the war, and in this he was stoutly supported by the French Premier. However, it was like a bombshell when Monsieur Reynaud asked if Great Britain would release France from her obligation not to negotiate for an armistice or peace without the consent of her ally. Winston could not give his consent, and, as he explained afterwards, although I knew how great French sufferings were, and that we had not so far endured equal trials or made equal contributions in the field, I felt bound to say that I could not give consent. The combined efforts of Winston and Monsieur Reynaud were of no avail, and when we left Tours, tears were pouring down Winston's cheeks as he said goodbye to the French Premier.
It was during this trip to Tours that Walter's fears that Winston might be directly threatened came true. The first occasion was an extraordinary attempt to kill him by Paul Reynaud's mistress, the Countess Hélène de Porte. She had always hated the English and was convinced that Churchill's attempts to keep France fighting was simply a plot to enable Britain to seize France's overseas empire. She worked tirelessly to persuade her lover that France must try to make peace with Germany and get the best terms she could. When she came face to face with Churchill, her rage boiled over.
A most notable feature of this meeting was the apparent hatred towards us of Helene de Porte. Undoubtedly, she was backing Pétain and those who wished to capitulate to the Germans. From what I heard, it appeared that she had raised her voice to such a degree of forcefulness that those who wished to carry on the war were in doubt. After the meeting in a kind of courtyard, she came out in a fury of hatred, obviously directed against Winston. She came forward with a determination to do him some harm. You could look into her eyes and tell two things, that she was a killer and that she was after Churchill. I drew my gun and moved down on her, and it was only through the intervention of myself and some of her French colleagues from the meeting that her efforts were unsuccessful. She was taken back into the villa screaming at Winston.
It was found that although the Countess had no gun, she did have a knife, and had obviously been ready to use it. The second near miss showed just how risky the sort of personal diplomacy which Winston insisted on could be during wartime.
On our return over the Channel, without fighter escort, our plane, being a civilian one and not armed except for Winston's Colt 45 and my own automatic, suddenly dived down towards the sea. We continued to fly at only a few hundred feet until we reached the coast of England. The reason was obvious. To the right of our plane, a German Heinkel was attacking some French fishing boats, and only by doing so missed seeing our plane.
It was a very narrow escape, because it would have been a very unequal contest. As Walter says, the Flamingo was not only unarmed, but slower than the Heinkel. Although the German aircraft was a bomber, it still had 6 machine guns on board, and would have made short work of the small, unprotected transport. As Walter remarked,
some German pilot will never know how near he was to winning the Iron Cross First Class. On this trip to France, Winston must have realized more than normally what we might have been up against in the way of personal danger, and that it might be difficult both to get into and out of France in the last days of that country's resistance. To my surprise, before leaving England, he turned to me and said, "Thompson, bring me my revolver." Rarely did he carry it, but I always had it with us. When I handed him his favourite Colt 45, he added, "One never knows. I do not intend to be taken alive."
As Winston and Walter returned to Britain, German forces were marching into Paris. The two men would not return to France again for almost exactly 4 years. On the 16th of June, in a desperate last attempt to keep France in the war, Winston made an extraordinary proposal.
He offered the French government, through the British ambassador, the following for their approval. The two governments declare that France and Great Britain shall no longer be two nations, but one Franco-British Union. The Constitution of the Union will provide for joint organs of defence, foreign financial and economic policies. Every citizen of France will enjoy immediate citizenship of Great Britain. Every British subject will become a citizen of France. Other advantages for both sides were mentioned, and Winston waited.
For a brief moment, there seemed a possibility that this might keep the French in the fight.
Meanwhile, a message for him to go to the prefecture of Bordeaux came through, and it was thought that the offer, if not accepted, could at least be debated. We were actually in the train at Waterloo Station, waiting to depart, Winston having informed me that we should probably be meeting the French cabinet somewhere on the French coast. If this meeting comes to fruition, he said, our two countries may be as one for the future. He seemed quite buoyed up by the prospect, but as we waited and no news arrived, he sat more gravely and became quiet with his head down, deep in thought. Then a secretary arrived to inform him that the Reynaud government had resigned, and that Marshal Pétain had formed a new government for the purpose of negotiating an armistice. Winston got up from his seat looking very grave. His statesmanlike offer of union with France had come to naught, and we were alone. For a moment he seemed staggered by the news, and I watched his face as he said, "It's all off. I'm afraid we are alone in this fight." We then returned to Downing Street, a very disappointed company.
2 days later, on the 18th of June, Winston went to the House of Commons to deliver one of his greatest speeches.
The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its commonwealths last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
For both Walter and Winston, and the rest of their compatriots, the great test was about to begin.